the Hasmukh Jethalal Mehta Memorial Oration. The Alumni Association of St. John's Medical College organizes this oration to perpetuate the memory of one of the most illustrious teachers ever to teach at St. John's Medical College. Dr. Mehta was the first professor of anatomy here and joined the college in 1964. With his unfortunate death in a tragic accident in August 73, the medical fraternity lost an excellent teacher and the world a man of friendship. The poignant end came in a tragic road accident just in front of the college gates. It was as if time snatched him away from his department minutes before it closed for the day to meet his tryst with destiny. Though he was known to be a strict disciplinarian, his students loved him and he was admired by his staff and colleagues. His knowledge of the subject was immense, and he had an intense interest in keeping abreast of recent advances. He combined this with an insatiable thirst for knowledge of the allied sciences and subjects of wide general interest. He could engross a company of intellectuals from diverse fields with a lucid exposition of subjects as varied as the history of medicine, economics, politics, sociology, and aesthetics. Dr. Mehta was constantly exploring better ways and newer teaching methods. Born on the 6th of October 1923 in Saurashtra, Gujarat, he had a brilliant scholastic career, always topping his class, whether it was in the LCPS or MBBS examination of the Mumbai University, then the Bombay University. After an initial dabbling in ophthalmology and pathology, he found his interest in anatomy, which he pursued with determination over the next 2.5 decades. He obtained his MSc in anatomy from the Gujarat University and then worked at the St. Anne Hospital of John Carroll University and Western Reserve University, Cleveland, Ohio. Since '64, he was chairman and professor of anatomy at St. John's Medical College. As a teacher, he was known for a very quick and candid assessment of the candidate and was a favorite examiner in various universities across India. An active member of many learned societies that had any bearing on anatomy, he was also interested in human biology and cytogenetics. To his credit, he had many valuable papers based on his diverse research interests. He attended many international and national conferences and presented his research work. He has written a chapter on embryology of the ureter in the book The Ureter by Harry Bergman and Heber. He has contributed articles even to Modi's Jurisprudence, a treatise widely studied by medical students in this country. His research interests included anthropology, genetics, embryology, histochemistry, and anatomy. Dr. Mehta was the principal investigator and co-investigator in many of the projects aided by the Indian Council of Medical Research and State Board of Medical Research. He encouraged his staff, students, and even the technicians to write papers. It is a pity that a progressive and productive career as this was suddenly cut short by the cruel hand of death. However, the memory of this dynamic personality loved by one and all who knew him is immortal in all of us here. To introduce the orator of the 32nd Dr. H.J. Mehta Memorial Oration, I now invite Dr. M.J. Saji, who is professor and ex-professor and head of orthopedics here, and widely known to us for his interest in pediatric orthopedics, and who has mastered the setting of the unit of hope, Dr. M.J. Saji.
Thank you, Kanisha. Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor K.M. Venkat Narayan as our H.J. Mehta Memorial Oration speaker today. I have known Venkat as he is popularly known since we joined St. John's Medical College as the 1974 batch, nearly 40 years ago. We were at the same anatomy table and shared many rotations during the MBBS course and internship. I have been following his career since then, and I am not the least bit surprised at what he has achieved. He has trained himself in 3 continents, but his work, inspirational leadership, and research in diabetes and obesity has had its global impact. He is probably the most influential name in diabetes today. His words of wisdom and knowledge in this field is being sought after by governments of developing world like India, Pakistan, Gulf and Latin American countries, Africa, China, and Russia. This is including the developed world. He is also an advisor to the United Nations and the World Health Organization. While he was working at the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, he was offered the post of Professor of Medicine and Chief of Global Health at the prestigious Emory University, which he rightly holds as we speak. Some of the faculty in this university includes His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the former President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, Salman Rushdie, and many more eminent names. We know that behind every successful man, there is a woman. But in Venkat's case, he is blessed with 3. His lovely and graceful wife, Asha, who's sitting here, his beautiful and bright daughter, Sarayu, and most of all, his mother, Jaya Auntie, who is also sitting here. Jaya Auntie has been Venkat's strength through the years and has been guiding his inexhaustible brilliance and drive into what he is today. In addition to his outstanding academic achievements, Venkat is a brilliant chess player, a poet, a playwright, and a very active social activist. Above all, he is a wonderful human being. Ladies and gentlemen, help me to welcome my good friend, a truly global Professor Venkat Narayan, a son of St. John's, should be very proud of him. Thank you very much. Venkat, the stage is yours.
Okay, will it work? Good morning, my dear friends. It's a great honor and a privilege to be giving this oration today, and it's especially poignant and touching to be introduced by my very best friend, Dr. Saji Joseph. In the course of life, we meet a lot of people, we make a lot of associations and connections, make some great friends, but if we are lucky, we might meet that 1 or 2 people who end up knowing us more than ourselves. And in my case, Saji Joseph is one such. And I am at most grateful for the friendship that I've had from people like Saji and others. So when I think of St. John's, the thing that comes foremost to my mind is the friendships that I have formed across my batch of 1974. Several classmates who have become lifelong friends, and in fact, I keep in touch with almost all of them over the course of the years. It would not be a hyperbole if I said that those boys and girls that you see in that picture look to my inner eye, to my mind's inner eye, exactly the way they looked in the autumn of 1974. It's a great batch. We don't brag, but we think we're the best batch in the school. And we are a highly connected batch. And as a scientist, I should show you data about how connected we are. So with the help of Deepak Edwards, I collected some surveillance information. And as an ex-CDC epidemiologist ought to do, I plotted an epidemic curve of the number of emails transmitting through our class listserv. As you see there, over the past 10 years, there have been nearly over 13,000 emails exchanged. And when you look at the yearly pattern, there seems to be a relentless endemic pattern of infection here. So to identify a point source, if there might be, I looked at the persons sending the emails, and there is a pattern here. There are people like Jovita, Ranga, and Deepak who send emails with the intention of organizing the group and bringing us all together. So they serve the phenomenon of providing herd immunity to the population, to our population. But then you also see some wild viruses at the on your other side, and I will let you decide whom to control if you have to contain the epidemic. Clearly, over one's course of life, one's traveled a lot, one's seen a lot, one's changed somewhat, not changed in other ways. But there is something about our lives, I don't know what it is, that always draws us back to certain special parts of our past. It is a sentiment expressed so beautifully in the closing lines of the great American classic, The Great Gatsby. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And I think it is that tug, that emotion, that really brings me back in connection to St. John's and to India at large, or to my family, etc. And this is a beautiful emotion that is very hard to explain away. I'm here today to speak in memory of Dr. H.J. Mehta. And as you heard from the introduction, Dr. Mehta was a very revered, very loved member of the St. John's community. And in fact, his connection goes back to the foundation of the college. Here he is with an early staff meeting at St. Mary's Orphanage, sitting next to Dr. Kalyankar, the professor of biochemistry. There is Dr. Mehta there in the black suit at the dedication ceremony of the college building in 1968, standing next to Dr. Bansod as he shakes hand with President Zakir Hussain. And here is a staff picture in 1968 where Dr. Mehta is sitting next to the first dean, Dr. Montero. So clearly I am honored, clearly I feel privileged, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be giving this talk. But as honored as I am, I also feel a certain paradox within my own mind and emotions to be doing this talk, for the simple reason, because truth be told, that I was a rather somewhat reluctant, accidental entrant into medicine. I had not reflected deeply about why I wanted to do medicine or whether I had the right aptitude. And indeed, that showed very much, especially during the first 18 months of medical school here, which I would personally describe, I was bored and disillusioned. That was up to me. It was my fault. Second, I considered quitting several times during those 1.5 years. And this is where I thank the strength that people like Saji gave me. He convinced me to stay on. And for 39 years later, I'm still here in medicine. However, there were some things that I tended to excel at even at that time. For example, again, without shame, I can admit that I had one of the poorest attendance records in my class. And I also consistently underperformed in examinations. And as a scientist, I thought I should show you some evidence. And here are my mark sheet from the first year anatomy exam. As you see there, I scored exactly 50%, barely passed. And this too, with the help of Professor Ramaswamy, who had to argue with the external examiner, Professor Veeraswamy, to make me pass. Thank you, Professor Ramaswamy. So in general, there it was, my days in medical school and a few years beyond, somewhat confused, somewhat idle, but generally reflective, I think. The days were rocky, but rather than reading anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry, I was spending my time enjoying reading the volumes of philosophy, poetry, literature. I was an active young theosophist. I explored a number of religions. I even tried a small hand at journalism. And when I finished medicine, I almost joined an MA in English Literature at the Central College, and almost joined a PhD in biomedical engineering at the Indian Institute of Science. But due to other reasons, I decided to leave the country. But before I come to that, I should also mention that in the impetuousness of my youth, I also ended up being actively involved in a junior doctor's strike. At that time, the primary cause driving the strike was to get St. John's start postgraduate education. So anyway, Father Glenn and Father Lawrence, I have made my confessions today as a true Catholic. But as a scientist, I wanted to evaluate the impact the strike may have had on people's health. So a few colleagues of mine, Dr. Salim Yusuf included, we did a systematic review of the world literature on doctor strike and mortality. And what this revealed was a paradoxical but consistent finding that every time doctors go on strike, mortality rates go down. So not only do I feel vindicated, I actually feel humbled along with all of you. And this is a lesson for young doctors, both young and old. As you walk the corridors of clinical power, always reflect on the impact you may or may not be having on the public's health, which you may never understand. When I left India, I spent about a year and a half in the Middle East. Then I made my way to England, where I started training in internal medicine. It was during my third year. I was a second-year medical registrar. It was the month of November 1985. I had started doing my own lists, as in, in terms of endoscopies. I was wondering whether I should go into gastroenterology. I still wasn't happy. There was another part of me that was drawing me into law, so I went to the Durham Law School and was considering joining that. It was a long weekend on call, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. I could not fall asleep, so I wandered into the library at Durham Hospital, at Dryburn Hospital in Durham, and I came across this book. For want of nothing else to do, I started reading that book at 4 a.m. in the morning, and the very first paragraph described what we would all recognize as the syndrome complex, the symptom complex of ischemic heart disease. There was nothing new about it. But then, the authors ask a very pertinent question. How did it ever first get established that this syndrome complex would be something akin to ischemic heart disease? And then it leads on to the entire systematic approach of inquiry, of critical thinking, of creating new knowledge. As I read the book, within 2 hours I was able to read the entire 200 pages. And for the first time I felt I had found something intuitive within the field of medicine that I could relate to. And very promptly the next day I started looking for jobs in epidemiology. And by February 1986, I had joined the training program in Scotland. By November 1989, I became a tenured consultant and senior lecturer in Aberdeen. And then a couple of years later, I met this amazing individual, Dr. Peter Bennett, who was running the Pima Indian study at the NIH. This was in 1990 at Cambridge, where I spent a couple of weeks attending a course. We interacted a lot, Peter Bennett and I enjoyed his motivation, I enjoyed his inquiry, I enjoyed his personality. And some months later, I got a beautiful letter from him inviting me to join the NIH. It was a tough decision to quit a consultant post in the UK, but we did do that, and thanks to Asha, who agreed to join with me, we moved to Phoenix in 1992, and I joined there as a visiting scientist with the NIH. This is really what brought me head-on with type 2 diabetes, which is in many ways an ancient disease meeting a contemporary 21st century lifestyle. When you look at the history of diabetes, over time, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Indians, the Arabs have all described diabetes in ancient times. And in fact, here's a beautiful quote for you from the 6th century Ayurvedic textbook, Charaka Samhita. There are two forms of diabetes. It's called Madhu Meha, one associated with emaciation, dehydration, polyuria, and lassitude, and the other with stout build, gluttony, obesity, and sleepiness. So 1500 years ago, these physicians are describing pretty much what we consider type 1 and type 2 diabetes today. And also a PhD student of mine, an anthropology student, reviewed the Sanskrit literature, and she found 25 words in the ancient Sanskrit literature which was associated with the disease diabetes, madhumeha, mutra alastra, etc. But our understanding of the modern epidemic of diabetes really goes to this unique population, the Pima Indians of Arizona. The Pima Indians were a pre-Columbian migration to the Americas. They are believed to have arrived 35,000 years ago, and there is physical anthropological evidence to support this. They are supposed to have originated from Central Asia, crossed the Bering Land Bridge, come into the Americas. Some settled near Mexico. Some came back to the banks of the Gila River near Phoenix, which is where they settled. They were a rather agricultural population until the early part of the last century. And then suddenly, there was an explosion of type 2 diabetes in this population in the second half of the last century, really starting after 1950. And what was shocking in the early 1960s was this finding that 50% of people in the Pima population aged 45 and over had diabetes, and all of it was type 2. And the onset of type 2 was as young as age 7 or 8. And these findings were so shocking at that time that the world received tremendous attention, and it was believed to be a unique feature of the Pima population. And I should also mention, when Dr. Peter Bennett went to study this population, he went there to study rheumatoid arthritis in the population, because the population was believed to have high risk of rheumatoid arthritis. So the finding of diabetes was incidental, and Dr. Bennett, being the brilliant scientist he was, shifted his entire career from being a rheumatologist to turning into a diabetologist. And I believe that's a very important lesson for anybody pursuing science. Have an open mind. You never know where the next big opportunity is going to come your way. But what was happening in the Pima Indians, little did people realize, was anticipating what was going to happen in the rest of the Americas. Shown here are data based on 17 years of incidence for the United States. And as you see there, children born in the year 2000 in America have a 1 in 3 chance of developing diabetes during their lifetime. And that risk is as high as 1 in 2 for our Hispanics and our blacks, a very, very high risk of disease indeed. And if you think it was just an American problem, and indeed, in the late 1990s, the Time magazine and Scientific American covered diabetes as an American epidemic, but not so when you look at data from the International Diabetes Federation, which we have been assembling for several years. What we are finding is that diabetes today is a truly global problem. And as we stand today, the latest estimates, there are about 366 million people with diabetes, the way we have counted it, and it is predicted to be about 550 million by 2030. And importantly, the increase in numbers of people with diabetes is occurring across all continents, including sub-Saharan Africa. And we have done recent data analyses showing that the increase is also in rural parts of low and middle income countries. And this is where diabetes and the epidemic of diabetes meets the concept of social justice, because in many countries, people who develop diabetes have their families ruined, because, like for example, data from Chennai suggests that one individual with diabetes costs the family 25% of the family income. And plus, when young people develop the disease like diabetes and its complications, they go out of the workforce, and therefore, this threatens the economies of many nations. Yet, in the last 15 years, strong evidence is accumulated for prevention of diabetes. There have been several trials of lifestyle intervention and also of pharmacological interventions. My talk today, I'm going to largely focus on lifestyle interventions because I think that's something we should pay greater attention to. I'm also going to focus mainly on prevention of diabetes rather than treatment, because I believe an epidemic like diabetes needs to be prevented. I'm going to start with a very important quote. The physician should take pride in the prevention of diabetes in his practice. The physician should consider it as important to prevent his patients acquiring diabetes as he feels it incumbent upon himself to vaccinate them against smallpox or typhoid fever, or to protect them from exposure to tuberculosis. The person who said this was not somebody simply from public health, but it was no less than Elliot Jocelyn, after whom the Jocelyn Clinic in Boston is named, the father of modern diabetology. And he wrote this in 1921, which was also the year insulin was discovered. So here there was excitement about treating diabetes, and there was a visionary like Jocelyn who was talking about prevention. These are the kind of leaders we need at St. John's, who can actually go beyond the paradigm of cure to start thinking of prevention in a more dynamic and positive way. About 70 years later, there was renewed interest to this whole field of prevention, and interest in scientifically to test whether prevention would be feasible. And at that time at the NIH, my mentor, Dr. Bill Noller, and several others were beginning to do some early investigations. And I had the great fortune of spending 4 years there, actually working with Bill very closely to make advocacy articles, write advocacy articles on the importance of prevention, designing a randomized controlled trial which would later inspire the NIDDK to invest $180 million to fund what would become the diabetes prevention program, a large randomized controlled trial. We also completed a pilot study of lifestyle interventions in the PIMAs. It was the first time we were intervening in the PIMAs, who had been observed for over 30 years. And then I left and moved on to CDC, but kept in touch with the diabetes prevention program. In the early 1990s, all we knew largely was that there was a strong association between body weight, as measured by body mass index, and the incidence of diabetes. So there was a monotonous risk. Overweight and obesity conferred excess risk. And secondly, when you measured people's 2-hour glucose today, and then followed them forwards over several years to identify who would develop diabetes based on the WHO criteria, there was a threshold effect. Around a 2-hour glucose of 140 milligrams per deciliter, the risks dramatically went up. And then, so that group with a 2-hour glucose of between 140 and 199, despite a normal fasting glucose, was called impaired glucose tolerance, or IGT. So between overweight and IGT, the two of them together became the target group for testing diabetes prevention studies, and several of those have happened in the last 15 years. The largest of these studies is the diabetes prevention program, funded primarily by the NIDDK, but also by CDC and others, a massive study across 27 centers in the United States, screening over 160,000 people of all diversity in the United States over a 2-year period to identify people with IGT and who were overweight for this trial. And all eligible participants received a standard lifestyle recommendation, which would be a maximum of 1 hour advice on how to modify diet and physical activity, something that you might all do in your clinical practice. And then people were randomized to actually 4 groups. The 4th group had to be discontinued after 14 months. It was troglodyrazone. But the 3 groups that remained were a placebo group, a metformin group. We are using metformin here in people with IGT long before they've developed diabetes, and an intensive lifestyle intervention. They were about the beautifully randomized design. And the goals of the lifestyle intervention were the following. It was a fairly intensive program that had evolved from over 20 years of behavioral research led by Dr. Rena Wing, who is now at Brown University. And the goals were, number 1, aim for 7% loss of body weight and then maintain that weight loss after that. So if you're a 200-pound person, try and lose 14 pounds. And the second big goal was 150 minutes of physical activity, which is about 30 minutes of walking a day, 5 times a week. And this was delivered not through lectures, but it was delivered through 24 weekly sessions, interactive weekly sessions, lasting between 90 to 120 minutes. A lot of work went into this. There was a lot of behavioral modification, a lot of psychology, a lot of social epidemiology was incorporated. So I want to make the point that you're not going to change people's lifetime lifestyle behavior with a lecture or a 20-minute warning. It's going to take several sessions. It's like a physical therapy for somebody having a stroke, or psychotherapy for somebody with psychological disorders. And the study, the DSMB, the Data Safety Monitoring Board, had to stop the study for two reasons. First, at 14 months, because the drug troglodyrazone had a pattern of adverse side effects. But secondly, the DSMB also performed its second major function, calling off the trial or asking the trial to be stopped because one of the interventions had achieved overwhelmingly positive results, and that was the lifestyle intervention. And shown here are the two lines comparing the incidence of diabetes in the lifestyle intervention group in blue and the placebo group in green. And the drug metformin fell right in the middle. So in relative terms, you're talking about a 31% reduction in the incidence of diabetes from metformin and a 58% reduction in the incidence of diabetes from lifestyle intervention. Another important feature of the study was that when we evaluated heterogeneity across age, it worked across all age groups, and in particular, look at the impact of the lifestyle intervention in people aged 60 and older. It had the biggest effect, suggesting that it's never too late to start diabetes prevention intervention. It worked across all ethnic groups pretty much equally, and we also looked at whether it worked across socioeconomic groups, it worked across education groups, it worked across income groups, it worked across gender. And the intervention also had impact on several other outcomes. Shown here, for example, is the impact of the intervention on the metabolic syndrome. So it was having effect beyond the effect on glucose. It impacted blood pressure, lipids, etc. And I won't show you data, but studies, follow-up studies have shown this intervention, and also a sister study called Look Ahead, showing that the impact of lifestyle intervention also benefits chronic kidney disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, knee arthritis, urinary incompetence in women, disability rates in older people, etc. So it's a very powerful and natural intervention. Another major diabetes prevention study, which was done in Finland, called the DPS, also achieved a 58% reduction in diabetes incidence in people with IGT. And this study had similar but slightly different goals. They had 5 goals: reduce weight by greater than 5%, reduce your fat intake to less than 30% of total energy intake, reduce your saturated fat intake to less than 10% of energy intake, increase your fiber to 15 grams for every 1,000 calories of energy intake, and increase your physical activity to 30 minutes of moderate exercise per day. And in their epidemiological analysis, they found this very interesting result. The more goals that were achieved, the lower the risk of diabetes. And this is a very encouraging message, because it's not an all or none thing. If you can do one thing at a time, start with it, and next month try to modify your behavior in another direction. So over time, you will have cumulative benefit. People often ask the question whether these lifestyle intervention benefits are sustainable over time, and there have been 3 studies that have reported 10 and 20-year follow-ups. But I'm showing you today the longest follow-up, which is from a study called Daqing, which is in the northwest of China. This was a study among people with IGT. They stopped the intervention at year 6. And in these analyses at year 6, there was roughly a 50% reduction in the incidence of diabetes. There was no intention to follow up the people at all until almost 12, 13 years later. My colleagues at CDC decided to go back to China to follow up this cohort of people, and they found over 80% of them back into follow-up. And what you see there, at the end of 20 years, there still is a huge differential benefit between the intervention group and the control group in terms of progression to diabetes. That's the good news. But the not so good news is, over 20 years, despite the intervention, a high proportion, almost 70%, go on to develop diabetes. So based on our estimations and modeling from various studies, we estimate that a powerful lifestyle intervention would postpone the onset of diabetes by about 12 years, which is a lot, which you take into account the amount you would postpone complications by, and the costs of complications by. A common thing that always comes up is diabetes is genetics. People always ask me the question, is it genetics? Maybe there's nothing I can do about it. And indeed, there have been about over 80 single nucleotide polymorphisms so far associated with diabetes. And together, they explain about 14% of all cases worldwide. But there are three things that I want to tell you about genetics quickly. First, these are data from the Framingham Offspring Study. To predict who would develop diabetes, a very simple model that has age, gender, family history, BMI, systolic blood pressure, that is your physical examination essentially, and one blood draw to give you HDL cholesterol, fasting plasma glucose, and triglyceride, can give you a very high accuracy to predict who would develop diabetes in the next 10 to 24 years. And adding all the genotypical information does not make that prediction budge at all, suggesting that we can pretty much predict diabetes risk based on simple tools, and we don't need to resort to expensive genotypical information for this. Second, as studies like the DPP have shown, I'm showing you data for the TCF7L2 gene, which is a major beta cell functional gene. In the placebo group of the DPP, the people in pink are those with the genotype, clearly had an excess risk of developing diabetes. But look at the lifestyle group. The lifestyle intervention almost eliminates the excess risk conferred by the gene. So essentially, there is no difference in disease progression between those with and without the gene. And these findings have also been shown for several other major genes in the US DPP and in the Finnish study. And I find this particularly encouraging to say that having genes for diabetes, even if you do have them, is not a sentence that you have to develop diabetes. There's much that can be done to ameliorate the excess risk. And another question that always comes up is, are there differences in gene across ethnic populations? And what this shows you, which compares the risk alleles, genetic risk alleles for European Americans, African Americans, Latinos, Japanese Americans, and Native Hawaiians, basically suggesting that there isn't, in the big picture, there aren't differences when it comes to genetic profiles. There are minor differences, but overall, there aren't that many differences. More recently, in the last several months, there's been this very impressive study published called the PREDIMED study. This was the first study to test a quality diet intervention, so essentially called the Mediterranean diet for want of another term. What they meant by a Mediterranean diet was essentially a diet that was high in high fiber carbohydrates, high in legumes, high in fruits and vegetables, high in monosaturated fats, either in the form of nuts or in the form of extra virgin olive oil. So, and plus, people who consumed alcohol were encouraged to drink at least 1 glass of red wine a day, and that's something that people remember a lot. So what it showed here, a 30% reduction between the control diet, which was a low-fat diet, versus the two Mediterranean diets, one which was rich in nuts, and the other which was rich in extra virgin olive oil. All the participants were asked to consume 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day. And none of the 3 groups had weight loss, but yet the groups receiving the intervention showed a 30% reduction in the hard endpoint of myocardial infarction, stroke, and death from cardiovascular diseases. So this tells us that it's not just about diet quantity or about weight, but also about diet quality. And I think this is where we need to shift some of the debate to. So when we review overall, what are the components of a successful lifestyle intervention program for preventing type 2 diabetes? It appears to be a multifaceted approach. There is no quick fix to it. There's no magic bullet to it. It is about reducing excess calorie intake if you are consuming so. And also, before you lose weight, wait for the aeroplanes to pass by. Better quality carbohydrates, like for example, replacing white rice with brown rice, refined bread with high fiber bread, etc. Reduction in fat intake, shifting more towards the monosaturated fats, increase in fiber, fruits and vegetables, increasing in leisure time physical activity, weight reduction if you're overweight or obese, but it's not always necessary, behavior change counseling, and most importantly, if you're planning to start a program of lifestyle intervention, it is a fairly rigorous program. You're talking about 16 plus 18, 24 weekly sessions. And a colleague of mine reviewed some translation studies, and it suggests that you require this frequency and this length of time and intensity to achieve positive benefits. Several countries have started implementing lifestyle interventions to prevent diabetes. If you went to Dubai, for example, they'll give you gold if you lost weight, but you need to be a native Dubaian. In the United States, the YMCA, the CDC, and the American Diabetes Association are forming a certification program for lifestyle intervention to be delivered via the YMCAs, and United Health Group, which is a major insurance company, will be reimbursing lifestyle interventions. In Finland, they have a national program. In Singapore, they're starting a national program, etc. In India, with funding from the International Diabetes Federation, we are running a translational trial in Chennai where we screened 20,000 people, and we are intervening in 602 with pre-diabetes to test the question. Suppose we took the data, the lessons from the diabetes prevention program, modified it, adapted it to the Indian situation, delivered it in a low-cost manner in the community setting. Can we achieve similar results? We'll be revealing these data towards the end of this year, so I won't say much about that. So this brings me to the next 10 minutes of my talk, which is about unique opportunities for investigating diabetes in South Asians. When you look at the global map of diabetes, in 2011, 2 South Asian countries, India and Bangladesh, are already among the top 10 in terms of numbers of people with diabetes. And based on our projections, an IDF group does projections for the future, we estimate that by 2030, there'll be 3 South Asian countries, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, which will be in the top 10 countries of the world with most numbers of people with diabetes. So India and Pakistan are not just competing in the nuclear arms race, they're also competing in numbers of people with diabetes. I don't know which one is more dangerous. These are data from Chennai over a 30-year period. What you see, huge increases in the prevalence of diabetes, as low as 2.3% in 1971, going up to 14.3% in 2004. And I'm going to show you some more recent data from 2011 in a minute. But importantly, when I joined Emory 7 years ago, we founded the Global Diabetes Research Center and formed strategic partnerships with several South Asian institutions. The Public Health Foundation of India in New Delhi, the Aga Khan University in Karachi, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi, and the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation in Chennai. And between Emory and CDC, we've been developing a program of research in cardiometabolic diseases in South Asia and elsewhere. So to build infrastructure, we have several strategic long-term projects. Number one, we are assembling a cohort of 28,000 people, representative of Chennai, Delhi, and Karachi, to investigate the causes of diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. As I mentioned, we have screened 20,000 people, and we're doing an applied trial of diabetes prevention in Chennai. We have another 10-center trial testing state-of-art care for people with diabetes across 10 sites and 1,200 people with diabetes. St. John's is a participating center in this trial. We are characterizing 150 young onset type 2 diabetes, that's diabetes before the age of 25 and all type 2, and doing a case control comparison. We have developed research coordination facilities in Delhi and Chennai in the process. We're also doing a lot of training, and we're using a two-way interactive training philosophy. First, collaborative training of doctoral and postdoctoral fellows from India, and we have had about 20 investigators who have come to Emory and been trained. We also conduct short courses. And simultaneously, we have a program for US doctoral and postdoctoral fellows to come to India and do India-focused research. We have had about 15 one-year fellowships funded in the scheme, and another 20 short-term trainees, etc., mostly through NIH grants. We've been building a core of faculty at Emory to support our India initiative. I've been fortunate to attract some of the brightest doctoral fellows and postdoctoral fellows at Emory who enjoy working on the Indian problems and visiting India and spending more than a year here. We hold annual meetings of our network, and this is a picture of our network meeting in Hyderabad. There's Dr. Prabhakaran there, there's Dr. Masood Qadir from Karachi, etc. Just to show you some data, and these are data from Chennai. I'm just going to show you data from Chennai, where we have done oral glucose tolerance tests on 4,500 people representative of Chennai. The 3 lines at the top are data from the Pima Indians over 3 time periods. I want you to focus on the line in green, which is the most recent data from the Pima Indians for the years 1991 to 2003. And clearly in the Pimas, in the very young age group, there's an increase in prevalence of diabetes, but there seems to be a decline or a plateauing of prevalence in adulthood. And then the line in dotted black there is the diabetes prevalence for US white Caucasians, just as a reference for you. But now let me draw your attention to the line in purple, which is your age-specific prevalence of diabetes in the Chennai population. And what you're seeing there is the prevalence of diabetes in the Chennai population is getting perilously close to the prevalence of diabetes in the Pima Indians. And by age 55, that is about my birth cohort, if anything, the Chennai prevalence is beginning to cross over or even overtake the Pima Indians, who have reputedly had the world's highest prevalence rates. And there are a few other populations in the world, particularly in the Middle East, which are beginning to show such high rates. But interestingly, when you look at the prevalence of pre-diabetes in the Chennai population and compare it with other populations of the world, that seems to be very, very low, at least in relative terms. This suggests one or two things. Either people in Chennai are converting very rapidly from pre-diabetes to diabetes, which seems to be true. But another explanation is that the epidemic is still at an immature stage, which means things are going to get worse in the future. Again, in the United States, we have about 36 million people who are foreign-born and who have come to the country from virtually every part of the world. And a colleague of mine, Rina Oza-Frank, she's a PhD student of mine, looked at diabetes prevalence across this population from nationally representative data. And I want to point out 2 things to you. First, the prevalence of diabetes among US immigrants is clearly highest in the members of the Indian subcontinent. And second, more importantly, if you look at the prevalence of diabetes in quote-unquote normal weight people from the Indian subcontinent there, and you looked at the prevalence of diabetes in obese people from European immigrants, the prevalence of diabetes in normal weight Indians is actually higher than the prevalence of diabetes in obese European immigrants. Again, it tells you there is something there. Either people migrating to the United States are preferentially diabetes prone, or there is some different relationship between obesity and diabetes in this population. This is where some of our recent investigations is beginning to shed light. Lisa Steinmetz, another of my PhD students, studied 1,200 people in Chennai. She classified them very carefully into 5 groups. Those who had normal glucose tolerance, they had normal fasting glucose, normal 2-hour glucose. Those with impaired fasting glucose, so they had a fasting glucose of 100 to 125 alone, but normal 2-hour glucose. Those with impaired glucose tolerance, these were people who had a 2-hour glucose of between 140 and 199, but normal fasting glucose. A group that had both IGT and IFG, and a group that was newly diagnosed with diabetes. And she measured 2 pathophysiological measures here. First, a HOMA-IR, which is a measure of insulin resistance in population studies, and that's shown in red. So as with successive stages of the natural history of diabetes, the insulin resistance goes up. That's nothing new. But shown on the other axis and in blue bars, it's what's called the oral disposition index. This is a fairly decent measure based on three-step glucose tolerance tests of the beta cell function. And this is adjusted for insulin sensitivity. So what you're seeing there at this end, clearly beta cell function drops rapidly as people develop diabetes. Again, that is nothing new. But what is new is what you're seeing here. Long before people migrate from normal glucose tolerance to early prediabetes, there's a huge drop in beta cell function. And that begins to challenge some of the paradigms we have held all along. And Lisa has run some spline analysis to see, are there points in the natural history where there's an acceleration in the decline of beta cell function? And as you see here, even around a fasting glucose of 90, quite low, there is evidence of an accelerated decline in beta cell function. So what we consider as normal glucose might not be totally normal. There might already be disease processes in progress. And similarly for 2-hour glucose. We looked at cases of young onset diabetes, 83 of them, who were diagnosed before the age of 25, and matched them with age-matched controls of prediabetes and normal glucose. And as you see here, clearly an increase in insulin resistance. But importantly, look at the oral disposition index, a measure of beta cell function. Huge drop between normal glucose and prediabetes. So the drop in beta cell function is much earlier than has long been believed to be. And this is what challenges our paradigm. The paradigm of diabetes has always been, originating from the Pima Indians, that the primary pathophysiological process is insulin resistance or poor insulin action. That leads to stress on the pancreatic beta cells, and that leads on to poor beta cell function or exhaustion. But perhaps there is an alternative model that we should conceptualize. And this is where knowledge of genes begins to shed some light. These are the genes that have been shown to be associated with diabetes using different phenotypical measurements. And if you believed that diabetes and obesity is a strong marker of insulin resistance, if the two of them were completely 100% connected, you would expect that the genes for diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and the genes for obesity would overlap dominantly, but they don't. Only 4 of the genes associated with diabetes actually map with obesity, suggesting that yes, obesity is a major determinant, but not the sole determinant of type 2 diabetes. There might be other biological processes involved. So the model that is being proposed now is that, yes, the older idea of insulin resistance being the driving force, it might still be true, but there might be an equally important, probably parallel and compelling process, which is driven by whether people have normal beta cells, where they have the compensatory ability to deal with the insults of a modern environment, such as obesity, poor lifestyle, physical activity, etc., or do they have a susceptible beta cell? And what we mean by susceptible, it might be genetics, epigenetics, nutritional insults, we really don't know. And so it is very conceivable that in populations like India and in Africa, for example, where there's an explosion, recent explosion of diabetes, that a large part of the population might have susceptible beta cell problems, and we don't know what those are. So to summarize, to prevent diabetes, we have strong evidence that lifestyle and or metformin can reduce the risk of diabetes in people with prediabetes. Second, the clear policy recommendations. And prediabetes is not a rare condition. You're talking about 20% of the population, roughly having that condition. So one policy recommendation might be that we need a program to identify people with prediabetes early, and then implement DPP-like lifestyle interventions, and then add metformin when needed. This would be a great opportunity to establish a clinical preventive diabetology department whose job it becomes to do this. And as the results from our DCLIP study in Chennai become available, we are working with the Indian government to try and scale this up through national policy. Finally, in terms of research priorities, we clearly need better understanding of the early biology of type 2 diabetes. We have to understand host susceptibility for type 2 diabetes, especially for early beta cell defects. And lastly and importantly, We need to understand the policy levers for prevention. That itself would be a whole talk, so I will not talk much about it, but the kind of things we are looking at are things like how do we reform agriculture to provide high-quality, low-cost foods to the population? What kind of urban planning do you need so that we don't have to worry about, we don't have to take an auto rickshaw to travel 1 mile. Ranga, Radha, and I came from Angasana to here, 33 kilometers. It took us 2 hours in a car. Some would argue you could cycle those 2 hours, the same 33 kilometers in 2 hours if the roads were safe. So things along those directions. And how do you provide universal health care that is affordable? Kind of ideas that Mr. Narayan Murthy touched on yesterday. So I have a lot of people to thank. My many colleagues at Emory University, CDC, NIH, over 2,000 collaborators worldwide, several funding organizations, over 35 of them. I feel very privileged to have in the audience today some very close family members. My wife, Asha, who's been a very sobering and stabilizing influence on me. My daughter, Sarayu, who's been a great source of inspiration. My uncle, Mr. Muthuswamy, who's been a father figure to me. My other aunts. And most importantly, my mother, Mrs. Jayalakshmi, who's been a driving inspiration throughout my life. I want to thank my mother and ask you all to please thank her on my behalf. Finally, I want to thank every member of the cast of the class of 1974. What St. John's is brilliant at is recruiting great students from very diverse backgrounds, people who are rounded, people who are not necessarily good at tests or just at exams, but rounded people. And I have benefited enormously from my association with my classmates. And when I tried to put this slide together, I could recount 59 of the 60 names within 2 minutes. And I struggled for 45 minutes to get the 60th name, which happened to be my own. And my daughter Sarayu was very amused. Just to conclude my presentation, I want to leave you with 3 thoughts, 3 of many inspirations that have touched me during my life. The first is that all that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. And I think this is extremely important for younger people entering into medicine. It is very glamorous to go into the super specialties, but perhaps your impact might be greater and your life quality might be wonderful too in places like primary care, in public health, in epidemiology, and in research. And also, never hesitate about doing things that you're passionate about, even if it appears to be a waste of time, because in the end, they all connect. Second, it is amazing what you can accomplish if you do not care who gets the credit. The agenda of public health and of education is so vast that the more we let go, the greater we achieve. And I think this is an idea that I think we need to take, and this is said by somebody no less than Harry Truman. And finally, the quote from our own Mahatma Gandhi, be the change you want to see. And I think this is extremely important. If you want to change the world, you have to practice the changes. And I don't think I can prescribe lifestyle interventions until I make some efforts to modify my own lifestyle myself. Talking of Gandhi, his famous 3 monkeys have always impressed me. And again, connecting the monkeys back to lifestyle, when you think about it, we all evolved from monkeys. And when you observe the monkey's lifestyle, it's about eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, a lot of nuts, jumping around from trees, across trees a lot, playing the fool in small groups, being socially supportive, sleeping when it's dark, and being awake when it's light. So I think we need to follow a monkey lifestyle to prevent diabetes. And on that note, at the Global Diabetes Research Center at Emory, we take that very seriously. Be the change you want to see. And it's time for me to shut up. Thank you very much.